You're listening to international investment advisor Doug Goldstein on the Goldstein on Gelt show, the financial show where we'll talk about how you can make the most of your money. With all the confusing financial chatter bombarding you each and every day, Goldstein on Gelt will give you the practical information you want and need about living a financially stable life. Here's your host, money maven Doug Goldstein.
Okay, we are back. I'm very happy to have back on the Goldstein on Gelt show Professor Alan Dershowitz, who's at Harvard Law. Last time he spoke to us about the relationship between Israel and the United States. Today I'd like to talk with the professor about sanctions on Iran and our whole very, very difficult situation with Iran. Professor, welcome back.
Well, thank you so much. I recently had occasion to speak to President Obama about the Iran situation and to several of Israel's leaders. And so I do have some information. I'm personally convinced that President Obama means it when he says that he will not allow Iran to develop nuclear weapons. But he is being undercut terribly by J Street. J Street, which claims to be a pro-Israel organization, and they are undercutting President Obama's credibility. They're making it harder for President Obama to persuasively argue to the Iranians that they will not be allowed to develop nuclear weapons and that the military option remains on the table. When an organization that purports to be pro-Israel, J Street, undercuts President Obama, undercuts the entire Israeli government, virtually everyone in Israel, wants to at least keep the American military option on the table, it's very hard to understand how J Street can claim to be a pro-Israel organization. On the issue of Iran, which is the existential, most important issue that Israel faces, J Street is a firm enemy of Israel. J Street is in the enemy camp, giving aid and solace to the enemies of Israel, including Iran.
Well, one of the discussions that comes up in the United States is, and in fact all of Europe as well, is, well, let's start with sanctions and see how that works. Is that a reasonable possibility?
It is, and I think sanctions alone will never work, but sanctions combined with a credible military threat could work. Now, it has to be a credible military threat, and when J Street says they're opposed to that threat, and they speak for a substantial number of American Jews and supporters of Israel, they eliminate the credible military threat and the sanctions on the table. And sanctions alone will not stop the Iranians from developing nuclear weapons.
It's clear that the Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, has every intention of using the military option if necessary against Iran. Do you think that the United States is simply waiting for that so that they don't have to get mired in the difficulties of yet another Middle Eastern war?
No, exactly the opposite. The United States does not want Israel to unilaterally attack Iran. It's concerned about what the implications would be both for Israel and for the international community. So I think it's very clear the United States government does not want Israel to attack Iran. I think Israel doesn't want to attack Iran except as an absolute last resort. It seems to me that it's far better for the United States to maintain a credible military threat, and if necessary to employ that military threat to prevent Iran from developing nuclear weapons. I think Iran will stop its development of nuclear weapons only if it believes it will be attacked by the United States. In many ways, there are some within Iran who might welcome an attack from Israel, particularly if the attack were an incomplete one or an unsuccessful one. It would help them stay in power. It would unite Iranians behind the regime, and that's why I think it's far better for this issue to be seen as an international one. Israel is not the only country that is threatened by Iran. All the Emirates, the Gulf states, Southern Europe, and the United States are threatened by the potential development of an Iranian nuclear weapon, and this is an issue that ought to be dealt with by the international community and by the United States, which is the leader of the free world.
What's the difference now with Iran compared to Iraq at the time when the original Gulf War started and people actually believed Iraq was a credible nuclear threat?
Well, you can be wrong about Iraq and right about Iran. There is absolutely no doubt in the world that Iran is seeking to develop nuclear weapons. We did not have anything like the kind of information we have relating to Iran about Iraq. There were no satellite photos of Iraqi nuclear facilities. We didn't have the kind of information from inside that we have in relation to Iran. The two situations are utterly not comparable. And you make the mistake when you think just because you erred about one nuclear threat that you have to err the other way with regard to another nuclear threat. The United States turned out to be wrong about Iraq. They acted in good faith, but they turned out to be wrong. We are right about Iran. There is absolutely no doubt. I don't know of any international serious person who believes that Iran is not on the way to developing nuclear weapons. Whether they have made the final decision or not, that's debatable, but they are progressing very quickly toward developing nuclear weapons, and that's a fact.
So let's compare it to another nuclear power, which would be North Korea, which we've had sanctions on them, and they didn't seem to mind, and now they are a nuclear power as well. Are we following the same path if we don't take a serious military stance now?
Yes, and there's a big difference. North Korea is a secular, atheistic regime. They don't believe in life after death. They don't believe in suicide bombing. They are rational players and rational calculators. When it comes to Iran, you just can't assume that's true. There are those within the leadership who honestly believe that you need Armageddon, or a form of Armageddon, before the arrival of the 12th Imam. Iran is a suicide nation, a nation that is willing to give up millions of its people in order to destroy its enemy. They showed that in the war with Iraq.
When you say that, you're referring to the leadership of Iran, not necessarily the people who would be the ones dying.
Oh, no, I'm talking about the imams who are in leadership positions. The people of Iran, in fact, statistically, are probably more pro-Western than in many other countries in the world.
Well, it seems very unpopular these days to attack a country just because you don't like the leaders, because then there's collateral damage, and it makes it very difficult when you want to have a military strike.
Well, that neglects that lessons of history. The leadership of Nazi Germany should have been attacked in 1934, 1935, 1936. Yes, there would have been collateral damage. Maybe a few hundred or thousand people would have been killed instead of the tens of millions of people who died and were killed as a result of us not taking action against the Nazi leadership of Germany after 1933. So you have to learn the lessons of history and not misinterpret historical lessons in the past, from the past.
If we're fighting against Iran, they are also a powerhouse. For example, they could do a great deal to affect the oil supply, which seems to be everyone's big concern. Is that a credible threat from their side?
I don't believe it is, because Saudi Arabia has essentially promised that it would make up for any shortage of oil if, in fact, the shortage of oil resulted from the destruction of Iran's nuclear capabilities. Saudi Arabia is very frightened about the possibility of Iran having nuclear weapons, and they have sufficient oil to satisfy the needs of the world, the needs of Europe particularly, and so I don't believe that today really poses a credible threat, although obviously it's something that the Iranians are posturing about.
Okay. We are talking with Professor Alan Dershowitz from Harvard Law School. He's been before on the Goldstein on Gelt show. Previously, he spoke about the relationship between Israel and the United States. If you missed that interview, you could download it at goldsteinongelt.com or simply look it up at YouTube. Professor, in just the last couple of minutes, could you just tell us the Iranian crisis would appear to be yet another example of the failure of the United Nations to actually unite nations against the forces of darkness and evil. Is that correct? Is there any reason to think that the United Nations should really be involved in solving this problem?
The United Nations is part of the problem, not part of the solution. It has never shown an ability to solve this kind of problem. Here, really for the first time, you have some inspectors under the auspices of the United Nations who are at least credibly stating that Iran is on the road to developing nuclear weapons, but don't expect the Security Council to act. Look, they can't even act to stop the humanitarian crisis that's going on in Syria, a humanitarian crisis, by the way, that is partly the fault of the Iranian government, which has long supported Syria, and partly the fault of Russia and China for not being willing to step in to stop the humanitarian crisis that's going on in Syria. Israel certainly cannot ever count on the United Nations to protect it from the threat of nuclear annihilation. It must depend on itself. And Israel has always had a policy of it will depend on no one, no matter how close a friend. It must always depend on its own ability to repel threats to its citizens.
Okay. You know, as you're saying this about the United Nations, I'm trying to think, what's an example of a time when there was some sort of evil dictator or a major humanitarian crisis brought upon by one country attacking the other, that the UN actually was there, stayed there, and solved the problem? And nothing comes to mind. Is there any example?
I don't think you can find any example, certainly not in modern history. There have been a few examples now where NATO has managed to finally, after long waits, do some good. Perhaps in Libya. We'll have to see what the end result looks like in the former Yugoslavia. But it's very hard to find an instance of the United Nations having prevented the rise of a dictator or prevented humanitarian crisis caused by the genocidal actions of dictators. So the United Nations, simply, you have to take them off the table as a potential player or deterrent to Iran's nuclear weapons. Okay,
well, with that positive thought in mind, we will hope for the best, and I hope that we will be speaking to you again very soon on the Goldstein on Gelt show when the Iranian nuclear crisis is no longer a crisis.
I appreciate that, but you can't hope for the best. You have to always act for the best. Hope is not good enough. Action must replace hope when it comes to a situation like the one facing the world from an nuclear-armed Iran.
So what are you recommending to our listeners who may not be the prime ministers and presidents of countries at the moment? Although I think they do listen to the show, I have to tell you.
Well, I think, first of all, to try to persuade J Street to change its policy in relation to Iran, because J Street's policy strongly undercuts the American threat, a credible American threat against Iran. Second, to keep pressure on public officials to maintain a credible military threat. That's the only way that Iran will be encouraged to stop its nuclear program, if it believes that it will be attacked by the United States.
Okay. Professor Alan Dershowitz, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you.
You've been listening to the Goldstein on Gelt show with money maven Doug Goldstein. Doug's weekly radio show is heard around the world, but if you miss it, you can download the podcast at www.goldsteinongelt.com. The Goldstein on Gelt show gives you up-to-date financial ideas so you can get on the path to financial freedom. If you'd like your questions answered on the air or off, send Doug an email to doug@profile-financial.com. It's your money for your future, so join Doug every week to build your wealth on the Goldstein on Gelt show.